Joe Fleetwood, and this is my Ancestry family tree. The name Joe Fleetwood actually came from a combination of my dad's first name and a nickname that I gave my grandfather. Um, um, Basically, he was not a fan of the band Fleetwood Mac, so I used to call him Fleetwood, and my sister used to call him Congrelo. So we just kind of made up names, and that's how I got the name Joe Fleetwood. My real name is Wesley Evans. My mother and father was Patricia Ann Brent and Joe Wesley Evans. My parents had three kids, actually. I had an older sister named Kimberly. She was stillborn, so she didn't make it. She passed away at birth. Then came myself, and of course, my younger sister, Nisi. My parents got married September 1975. My father was from Bellamy, Alabama. My mom from Columbus, Georgia. My parents were not around because they passed away May 1981, shortly after my youngest sister's second birthday and before my fourth birthday. The cause of death was a car accident. From my understanding, they were on their way back from seeing my dad's dad, my grandfather, somewhere in Alabama, and my dad was driving, fell asleep on the way back home, and they passed away in a car accident. So I have very few memories of my parents, but I do have some small ones, and my sister doesn't remember them at all. So this is the death citation, the notice that went in the newspaper um, back when my parents passed away, and this is the one for my dad. It says citation to all whom it may concern, Evelina Brent, that's my grandmother, having in due form applied to me permanent letters of administration upon the estate of Joe Wesley Evans deceased. This is to notify the next of kin and creditors of said Joe Wesley Evans deceased. That said, application will be heard at the regular September term 1981 of the probate court, said county. Witness my hand and official signature this fourth day of August 1981, Homer G. Suggs, probate judge. And then also, since my mom was from Columbus, Georgia, um, of course, the family has an obituary. And then there is one that the uh, county does as well. So this is not the official one, but this is my mother's obituary. Yeah, so my parents died really young. My dad was 29, my mom was 27. Um, so yeah, they were real young when they passed away. But I was raised by my grandparents, Evelina Bryson was her maiden name. My grandfather, Willie Lee Brent. Um, so in doing this ancestry timeline, so to speak, it helped me put things into perspective. And I think if you were thinking about doing it, you should, because it will help you understand the people who raised you. I know it had to be extremely hard on my grandmother because she was already in her 70s when she got us, a three and a 2 and a 3-year-old. My grandfather was in his 60s. And by the time I was even old enough to remember my grandmother's age, she was in her 80s. So imagine being in your 80s and you have, small children that you have to raise. My grandmother was born in 1912, my grandfather in 1922. So, of course, those were different times to be brought up in. But as I went back and paid attention to my grandfather's and my grandmother's life, I now kind of understand why they were the way they were, especially my grandfather. Now, one of the interesting things I found out while doing my research on my family tree was my grandfather's last name. My grandfather's last name was Brent. However, when I started looking at the records, it had his name as Brentson and Brentston. So the only thing I could think of was at this time is that either there was a language barrier in the way my grandfather spoke versus, and when I say language barrier, I just mean him, having a Southern drawl and, speaking to whoever it was at the courthouse. But here's his marriage license and my grandmother's. And on this marriage license, it has his name as Willie Lee Brinson. Come to find out, it was just that. It was a language barrier just between the Southern draws and the way my grandfather spoke and the way that the people at the Census Bureau and the probate court understood him. So his name was not Brinson, but a lot of the records show Brinson. And then there's also where there is an adjustment to where his name is actually listed as Willie Lee Brent. This is the census report from 1940s that has my grandfather listed on it. When I found the report, they actually had a full breakdown of what was in this census report, when it came to my grandfather. Now, it's a record of index. So they put estimated birth of 1923. My grandfather was actually born in 1922. That also wasn't uncommon because after a child was born, birth certificates sometimes didn't show up until a year later. And the majority of the time, the year of birth was wrong, but he was actually born in 1922. Same thing with my grandmother. She said that her mom told her she was actually born in 1911 and not 1912. What it says, male, Negro, birthplace, Georgia, single. And it has son because at this time he was still at home. He was 17 years old. Out of Wrightsville, Georgia. Did he attend school? No, he was a laborer. He's at 17 years old during this time frame in the 1940 census. The highest grade my grandfather completed was the third grade. He was an unpaid family worker at 17. He had no source of income. My grandfather worked 60 hours a week. So imagine being 17 years old, working on the family farm, and you have absolutely no income. Of course, times were different back then. 1945 is when he married my grandmother. He was 22 years old. My grandmother was 32. She's 10 years, recorded 10 years older than my grandfather. I actually didn't know my grandfather couldn't read because he drove, so I assumed he could read signs. Didn't know that he was actually just driving from knowledge. My grandmother could read and write, so I just assumed that my grandfather could. My sister actually was the one that told me my grandfather didn't know how to read, but he could sign his name. But apparently, when it came to cashing his checks, that's the one thing that he really needed to know how to do, so he learned how to sign his name. My grandfather was a very stern man. He was very hard. It seemed like he was angry all the time, especially when you asked him to do something. So as I go back and I look at history and I look at the times in which my grandfather was alive, by doing this, it actually helped me to understand why he was the way he was. One of the things that always stuck in my mind was there was an incident where my grandfather's wallet got stolen. I used to go to the mall all the time when I was a young kid. I actually was befriended by this cop named Officer Sean. Officer Sean found my grandfather's wallet and he brought it back to the house. And when he drove up, I was outside with my grandfather at the time, and the cop called my name. And my grandfather immediately got defensive. He was like, "How does this cop know your name? Are you at that mall stealing? What's going on?" Like, he immediately got defensive and sent me in the house. And Officer Sean was like, "No, it's cool. He was like, I see your grandson at the mall all the time, and we spoke. He's a really good kid. So like he immediately got on the defensive and wanted to remove me from the situation. I understand now, but I didn't back then, that he was just removing me from the situation in case there was an altercation between him and the cop. He didn't want me to see that. My mom was the youngest of 5 kids. So my mom was actually the second daughter my grandparents lost. She had an older sister named Diane that passed away. And then, of course, like I said, my mom passed away in 84. Um, but one of the things, like I said, it does give you perspective when you look at it from, or when I look at it from my grandparents, life during that time. So let's look at, so I went back, pulled some dates, and I said, okay, what were some of the things that my grandfather had to witness or hear about or go through? So in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. Basically, if you don't know, this was a law that was ending segregations in school. And this was the year that my mom was born. But what, actually, I, from my understanding of what I believed, and this just knowing how my grandmother was, she probably viewed this as a good thing. And I say that because one of the situations she did to my sister and I when we were in elementary school, I didn't want to leave Rigdon Road, which was the elementary school we were in. When they created the busing system to send us to a different district to go to school, I was in the 4th grade. I think my sister was in the 3rd grade at the time. And she said, as soon as your sister is old enough to ride the bus, I am going to send you guys to Clubview. And everything in my body did not want to go to Clubview. I did not want to leave my friends at Rigdon Road, did not want to do it. Yeah. And so when I, look at this Brown versus Board of Education and think back to that time frame, I could definitely see my grandmother kind of, seeing the progress and saying that, hey, this is a step in the right direction. Um, but a year later, Emmett Till happened. So if you're a man and you feel like you have to protect your family, in my grandfather's eyes, you know, your heart towards that situation is going to be something different. You want me to send my kids off to a school and in a situation away from my protection where I could possibly worry about something like that happening. Another situation is the Ruby Bridges escort in 1960. This is a 6-year-old girl in Louisiana that is having to be escorted to school by U.S. Marshals because there's an angry mob for allowing a black girl to enter an elementary school that is all white students. So if you have a 6-year-old daughter like my mom was at the time, I definitely see my grandfather having a heightened sense of awareness. And I can see my grandmother praying about it and saying that, hey, this is just one of the fights that we have to deal with. One of the things I didn't learn in history, or I didn't take enough time to do, is have conversations like this when I was in school with my grandparents. I had a few, but I don't think I had enough or even knew the right questions to ask to get an understanding as to why things were the way they were. One thing my grandmother used to always say, when I wanted to go do something, or my sister and I wanted to go do something, we would leave the house. She was like, hey, if you guys go out there and get in trouble, they're going to take you away from us. She had this fear that if we were to leave, go out and get in trouble, because they got us as through wards of the court, after our parents died. She just felt like if we went out, got into any kind of trouble, we would be taken away. So, you know, once again, when I look at the history that they had to deal with during their time frame, I can completely understand why I felt the way I did about my grandfather and my grandmother, um, because of what they had to go through. But I say my grandfather because he was the one uh, that kind of, he was the male role model in the house for me. So a lot of things that I saw and understood and the way I looked at the world, I got from him. But my grandmother was there to provide that balance because she was always the mild mannered. She was less aggressive. My grandfather was more of, he didn't want to be bothered. He finally got to a place of comfort. He had his house, his kids were grown, the ones that survived, and they're off doing their own thing. He just didn't want to be bothered with, grandkids, young kids. I can completely understand that. I couldn't imagine how much stress it was on that man just to get his kids to the point that they're alive, surviving, and thriving. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I completely understand that. Reason I even got started on doing my ancestry family tree is because I wanted to know more about my dad's side of the family. After my dad passed, or I shouldn't even say after he passed, I would say, yeah, I guess as I got a little older, I kind of started to wonder about that side of the family because I hadn't really heard much from them other than a cousin of mine named Carl, who actually lived in the same area that I lived in. He would always say, "Hey man, come by the house and see me sometime. I'm your cousin Carl." So I asked my grandparents about it, and it was like, "Yeah, he's your cousin on your dad's side." I knew I had grandmother. I didn't know my dad's dad, but I did know about my grandmother, Olivet.